Hello, New Life. So the question is just how big was Goliath anyway? I mean, this is what so many people wonder and think about. And the big thing that people always focus on with Goliath is how big was he? But let's just look at this passage a little bit. And this is the second video, kind of background information that um, I'm sharing with you. And so let's just jump into the passage here. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath. Notice where he's from. His hometown is Gath, one of those Philistine cities. He came out of the Philistines' camp. He was over 9 feet tall. Now, 9 feet tall, literally in the scriptures, in the Hebrew scripture, it says 6 cubits and a span. We'll get into that more in a minute. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That would have been about 125 pounds, roughly. So a coat of scale armor. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves. That would have been on his lower legs, protecting his shins. And a bronze javelin was slung on his back. The javelin would have been for throwing. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Now let's just stop there for a moment, and I know everybody wants to know the question about, well, how big was Goliath? But before we talk about that, and we're going to talk about that, but before we do, I want you to think a minute about the armor that he's wearing. He has a helmet on his head, bronze helmet. He has a coat of scale armors, little, like rectangular pieces of bronze sewed in rows onto a coat of some kind, so that would have provided, as those scales overlapped each other, protection from spears and swords and what have you. He had a bronze javelin that he carried on his back. That would have been for throwing. And then he had a large spear, and the spear would have been for fighting hand to hand with. He also had, not mentioned in the verses we read, but we know from later on in the passage, he had an iron sword as well. And then he also has a shield. Now, we're not told much about the shield other than that it's so big that it requires a separate shield bearer to go before him. So Goliath is fully armored. He's got the helmet, he's got the armor coat, he's got the greaves on his leg, he's got the shield, and he's fully weaponed. He's got the javelin, he's got the shield, he's got the spear, and then he also has the sword. So there's a lot of things, and two things in particular. He mentions that the spear has an iron head. It's about 15 pounds. Well, iron is much harder metal than bronze, and so it takes an edge better, it holds an edge better. It's a much better metal for making swords and spears and things of that nature. So he has an iron sword and an iron spearhead on a big wooden staff. And so this is a man who has got all of the latest technology. He's got all of the latest battle equipment available to him. He is protected as much as possible, and he has as many weapons as he could possibly have. He is fully geared up and ready to go. Now, I mention all of this because I want to show you a passage from a little later on, a little earlier actually, in 1 Samuel. It's in 1 Samuel 13. And it says, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.' So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened." All right, so it says down to the Philistines, because remember, the Philistines live in the cities down on the coastal plain where the trade route comes through. And with the trade route comes all the latest technology and all the latest wealth. And so the Philistines have the technology to make iron, and they have the blacksmiths there. But because they rule over the people of Israel, they haven't allowed the Israelites to have blacksmiths. They don't have the secret of making iron. And so they're forced to go to the Philistines to get even their farm equipment sharpened. And then it says, on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now, 1 Samuel 13 happened several years before 1 Samuel 17. So the events here occur several years before the time of David and Goliath. And so I'm sure in the intervening years, because they fought battles that they have won and they've been able to scavenge the dead and the camps of the defeated army, that the Israelites have more than just two spears and swords now. I'm sure they're much better equipped. But I doubt very seriously that they are anywhere near as equipped as the Philistines are. And at the end of this chapter, one of the things that's mentioned is that the Israelites plunder the Philistine camp. And it's not that they're looking so much for gold and silver and money. They're plundering it for armor and weapons so that they can be more prepared and more armored themselves. So I thought it was worthwhile at least to look at this and to recognize, and maybe even to give some of the men in the Israelite army who for 40 days sat there and looked at this guy covered in all this armor with all these weapons with his size. I thought it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about that so that we can see that they weren't equipped at the same level that he was equipped. They would have been jumping into a battle not only with a man who was much bigger than them, but with somebody who was much better equipped than they would have been as well. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about how big was Goliath. The passage said there that he was 9 feet, over 9 feet tall. The Hebrew text, the most commonly accepted Hebrew text called the Masoretic text, literally says that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. Now a cubit is started off as a measurement that went from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, that distance there. And there were actually some standards, because whose arm are you measuring, right? And so there actually became some standards around, and there was what was known as the long cubit and what was known as the short cubit. And the long cubit was just over 20 inches long, and the short cubit was just short of 18 inches, or generally just called 18 inches long. A span was the distance from the little finger to the thumb, stretched across there when your hand stretched as wide as it could go. Generally, a sort of standard of 9 inches, give or take, is accepted for a span. So if we take those measurements, Goliath would have been, by the short cubit, he would have been 9 feet, 9 inches tall. If we go by the longer cubit, he would have been 10 feet, 9 inches tall. Either way, a very tall man, a very big man, much larger than any normal man that we would have even living today. Interestingly enough, the average height of somebody back in that period of time would have been somewhere around 5'4", give or take just a little bit, but in that range, 5'4". These were not tall people back then in general. One of the things that is mentioned is that Saul himself was head and shoulders above all the rest of the people of Israel. We're never told exactly how tall he is, but it is mentioned that he was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. And so height was the thing. Now, some people really struggle to accept the idea of a 10-foot tall person. You know, the most tall, or the tallest contemporary guy is a guy that was just shy, I think he was 8'10" or 8'11", just shy of 9 feet tall, and lived back in I think it was the 50s. in the U.S. here. There's been other super tall people that lived in India and various places in Europe. Um, but people really struggle with that idea. One thing that can cause that is there is a disease called acromegaly where the pituitary gland continues to put out growth hormone, and that's kind of what happened with some of those really tall people. And so some people have speculated that maybe Goliath had that disease, that condition, as it were, and that's how he got to be so big. But probably that's not really all that likely, because in the Old Testament there is a whole pattern, a whole tradition throughout the Old Testament of talking about people who were extremely large, giants, if you would. The first, or one of the first, is the Nephilim that are mentioned in Genesis. I believe it's chapter 6. But there are other ones. The Anakites are considered to be giants as well. And so it seems like that there were some tribes or families of people that were just extremely large in the ancient world. And so I want to show you one more time just a couple of more scriptures that kind of point some of this out to us. So let's look at these. Now, 1 Chronicles chapter 20 is giving us kind of a review at the end of David's life of some of the accomplishments of David and his mighty men. And so it's just kind of a listing of things that happen. But it says in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 4, after this there arose a war with the Philistines at Gezer. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants, and the Philistines were subdued. And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. A Gittite is literally just somebody from Gath, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. And so, verse 8, they were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So there we see that during this time of David, there was a whole family or clan or tribe or whatever you want to say, based in Gath, this town of Gath, of giants. And that, there was this 6-fingered man who was a giant. We're not told a name. There was Goliath's brother. There was Goliath himself. There was a couple other ones that were mentioned that were killed there in that passage. So to me, this makes it less likely that it's some kind of a disease or condition, and more that just there were people that were that tall back then. Obviously, they don't exist now, but the Bible seems to indicate that they did exist then. So there you go. How tall was Goliath? We probably won't know exactly until we get to heaven, and maybe we can ask David himself someday. But he was in every respect a very large man, a very well armored man, a very well weaponed man. He would have been nobody to mess with on the battlefield. Somebody who was very accomplished at his trade, and a scary person to be around. So we can understand where the fear comes from, but clearly the power of God was able to overcome even this giant. So there you have it. You guys have a great day. I hope this has been interesting and maybe even encouraging for you today.